Brazil, Portuguese, Brazil, Portuguese pronunciation, Brasil, officially the Federative Republic of Brazil, Portuguese, República Federativa do Brasil, listen, is the largest country in both South America and Latin America. At 8.5 million square kilometers, 3.2 million square miles, and with over 208 million people, Brazil is the world's fifth largest country by area and the fifth most populous. Its capital is Brasilia, and its most populated city is São Paulo. The federation is composed of the union of the 26 states, the federal district, and the 5,570 municipalities. It is the largest country to have Portuguese as an official language and the only one in the Americas. It is also one of the most multicultural and ethnically diverse nations, due to over a century of mass immigration from around the world. Bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the east, Brazil has a coastline of 7,491 kilometers, 4,655 miles. It borders all other countries in South America except Ecuador and Chile and covers 47.3% of the continent's land area. Its Amazon River basin includes a vast tropical forest, home to diverse wildlife, a variety of ecological systems, and extensive natural resources spanning numerous protected habitats. This unique environmental heritage makes Brazil one of 17 megadiverse countries, and is the subject of significant global interest and debate regarding deforestation and environmental protection. Brazil was inhabited by numerous tribal nations prior to the landing in 1500 of explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral, who claimed the area for the Portuguese Empire. Brazil remained a Portuguese colony until 1808, when the capital of the empire was transferred from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro. In 1815, the colony was elevated to the rank of kingdom upon the formation of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarves. Independence was achieved in 1822 with the creation of the Empire of Brazil, a unitary state governed under a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary system. The ratification of the first constitution in 1824 led to the formation of a bicameral legislature, now called the National Congress. The country became a presidential republic in 1889 following a military coup d'état. An authoritarian military junta came to power in 1964 and ruled until 1985, after which civilian governance resumed. Brazil's current constitution, formulated in 1988, defines it as a democratic federal republic. Due to its rich culture and history, the country ranks 13th in the world by number of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Brazil is considered an advanced emerging economy. It has the 9th largest GDP in the world by nominal, and 8 by PPP measures. It is one of the world's major breadbaskets, being the largest producer of coffee for the last 150 years. It is classified as an upper-middle income economy by the World Bank and a newly industrialized country, with the largest share of global wealth in Latin America. Brazil is a regional power and sometimes considered a great or a middle power in international affairs. On account of its international recognition and influence, the country is subsequently classified as an emerging power and a potential superpower by several analysts. Brazil is a founding member of the United Nations, the G20, BRICS, Union of South American Nations, Mercosur, Organization of American States, Organization of Ibero-American States and the Community of Portuguese-language countries. Etymology. It is likely that the word Brazil comes from the Portuguese word for Brazil wood, a tree that once grew plentifully along the Brazilian coast. In Portuguese, Brazil wood is called pau-brasil, with the word Brazil commonly given the etymology red like an ember, formed from brasa, ember, and the suffix seal, from Iculum or ilium. As Brazil wood produces a deep red dye, it was highly valued by the European textile industry and was the earliest commercially exploited product from Brazil. Throughout the 16th century, massive amounts of Brazil wood were harvested by indigenous peoples, mostly Tupi, along the Brazilian coast, who sold the timber to European traders, mostly Portuguese, but also French, in return for assorted European consumer goods. The official Portuguese name of the land, in original Portuguese records, was the Land of the Holy Cross, Terra de Santa Cruz, but European sailors and merchants commonly called it simply the land of Brazil, Terra do Brasil, because of the Brazilwood trade. The popular appellation eclipsed and eventually supplanted the official Portuguese name. Some early sailors called it the land of parrots. In the Guarani language, an official language of Paraguay, Brazil is called Pindorama. This was the name the indigenous population gave to the region, meaning land of the palm trees. History. Pre-Cambrian era. Some of the earliest human remains found in the Americas, Lusa woman, were found in the area of Pedro Leopoldo, Minas Gerais and provide evidence of human habitation going back at least 11,000 years. The earliest pottery ever found in the Western Hemisphere was excavated in the Amazon basin of Brazil and radiocarbon dated to 8,000 years ago, 6000 BC. The pottery was found near Santarém and provides evidence that the tropical forest region supported a complex prehistoric culture. The Marajoara culture flourished on Marajo in the Amazon Delta from 800 CE to 1400 CE, developing sophisticated pottery, social stratification, large populations, mound building, and complex social formations such as chiefdoms. Around the time of the Portuguese arrival, the territory of current-day Brazil had an estimated indigenous population of 7 million people, mostly semi-nomadic, who subsisted on hunting, fishing, gathering, and migrant agriculture. The indigenous population of Brazil comprised several large indigenous ethnic groups, for example the Tupis, Guaranese, Jis and Arawaks. The Tupi people were subdivided into the Tupanicans and Tupinambas, and there were also many subdivisions of the other groups. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the boundaries between these groups and their subgroups were marked by wars that arose from differences in culture, language and moral beliefs. These wars also involved large-scale military actions on land and water, with cannibalistic rituals on prisoners of war. While heredity had some weight, leadership status was more subdued over time, than allocated in succession ceremonies and conventions. Slavery among the Indians had a different meaning than it had for Europeans, since it originated from a diverse socio-economic organization, in which asymmetries were translated into kinship relations. Portuguese colonization. The land now called Brazil was claimed for the Portuguese Empire on April 22, 1500, with the arrival of the Portuguese fleet commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral. The Portuguese encountered indigenous peoples divided into several tribes, most of whom spoke languages of the Tupi-Guarani family, and fought among themselves. Though the first settlement was founded in 1532, colonization effectively began in 1534, when King John III of Portugal divided the territory into the 15 private and autonomous captaincy colonies of Brazil. However, the decentralized and unorganized tendencies of the captaincy colonies proved problematic, and in 1549 the Portuguese king restructured them into the Governorate General of Brazil, a single and centralized Portuguese colony in South America. In the first 2 centuries of colonization, indigenous and European groups lived in constant war, establishing opportunistic alliances in order to gain advantages against each other. By the mid-16th century, cane sugars had become Brazil's most important export, and slaves purchased in sub-Saharan Africa, in the slave market of Western Africa, not only those from Portuguese allies of their colonies in Angola and Mozambique, had become its largest import, to cope with plantations of sugar cane, due to increasing international demand for Brazilian sugar. By the end of the 17th century, sugarcane exports began to decline, and the discovery of gold by Bandrins in the 1690s would become the new backbone of the colony's economy, fostering a Brazilian gold rush which attracted thousands of new settlers to Brazil from Portugal and all Portuguese colonies around the world. This increased level of immigration in turn caused some conflicts between newcomers and old settlers. Portuguese expeditions known as banderas gradually advanced the Portugal colonial original frontiers in South America to approximately the current Brazilian borders. In this era other European powers tried to colonize parts of Brazil, in incursions that the Portuguese had to fight, notably the French in Rio during the 1560s, in Murnau during the 1610s, and the Dutch in Bahia and Pernambuco, during the Dutch-Portuguese War, after the end of Iberian Union. The Portuguese colonial administration in Brazil had two objectives that would ensure colonial order and the monopoly of Portugal's wealthiest and largest colony: to keep under control and eradicate all forms of slave rebellion and resistance, such as the Quilombo of Palmeiras, and to repress all movements for autonomy or independence, such as the Minas Conspiracy. United Kingdom with Portugal. In late 1807, Spanish and Napoleonic forces threatened the security of continental Portugal, causing Prince Regent João, in the name of Queen Maria I, to move the royal court from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro. There they established some of Brazil's first financial institutions, such as its local stock exchanges, and its national bank, additionally ending the Portuguese monopoly on Brazilian trade and opening Brazil to other nations. In 1809, in retaliation for being forced into exile, the Prince Regent ordered the Portuguese conquest of French Guiana. With the end of the Peninsular War in 1814, the courts of Europe demanded that Queen Maria I and Prince Regent João return to Portugal, deeming it unfit for the head of an ancient European monarchy to reside in a colony. In 1815, to justify continuing to live in Brazil, where the royal court had thrived for the prior 6 years, the Crown established the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, thus creating a pluricontinental transatlantic monarchic state. However, such a ploy did not last long, since the leadership in Portugal, resentful of the new status of its larger colony, continued to require the return of court to Lisbon, as postulated by the Liberal Revolution of 1820, and also groups of Brazilians, impatient for practical and real changes, still demanded independence and a republic, as demonstrated by the 1817 Pernambucan revolt. In 1821, as a demand of revolutionaries who had taken the city of Porto, de João was unable to hold out any longer, and departed for Lisbon. There he swore an oath to the new constitution, leaving his son, Prince Pedro de Alcântara, as regent of the Kingdom of Brazil. Independent Empire. Tensions between Portuguese and Brazilians increased, and the Portuguese Cortes, guided by the new political regime imposed by the 1820 Liberal Revolution, tried to re-establish Brazil as a colony. The Brazilians refused to yield, and Prince Pedro decided to stand with them, declaring the country's independence from Portugal on September 7, 1822. A month later, Prince Pedro was declared the first emperor of Brazil, with the royal title of Dom Pedro I, resulting in the foundation of the Empire of Brazil. The Brazilian War of Independence, which had already begun along this process, spread through the northern, northeastern regions and in Cisplatina province. The last Portuguese soldiers surrendered on March 8, 1824. Portugal officially recognized Brazil on August 29, 1825. On April 7, 1831, worn down by years of administrative turmoil and political dissent with both liberal and conservative sides of politics, including an attempt of republican secession, and unreconciled to the way that absolutists in Portugal had given in the succession of King John VI, Pedro I went to Portugal to reclaim his daughter's crown, abdicating the Brazilian throne in favor of his 5-year-old son and heir, who thus became the empire's second monarch, with the royal title of Dom Pedro II. As the new emperor could not exert his constitutional powers until he came of age, a regency was set up by the National Assembly. In the absence of a charismatic figure who could represent a moderate face of power, during this period a series of localized rebellions took place, such as the Cabanejamem Grau-Para province, the Male Revolt in Salvador da Bahia, the Baleada, Maranhão, the Sabaneta, Bahia, and the Ragamuffin War, which began in Rio Grande do Sul and was supported by Giuseppe Garibaldi. These emerged from the dissatisfaction of the provinces with the central power, coupled with old and latent social tensions peculiar to a vast, slave-holding and newly independent nation-state. This period of internal political and social upheaval, which included the Praieiro revolt in Pernambuco, was overcome only at the end of the 1840s, years after the end of the Regency, which occurred with the premature coronation of Pedro II in 1841. During the last phase of the monarchy, internal political debate centered on the issue of slavery. The Atlantic slave trade was abandoned in 1850, as a result of the British Aberdeen Act, but only in May 1888, after a long process of internal mobilization and debate for an ethical and legal dismantling of slavery in the country, was the institution formally abolished. The foreign affairs policies of the monarchy dealt with issues with the countries of the Southern Cone with whom Brazil had borders. Long after the Cisplatin War that resulted in independence for Uruguay, Brazil won 3 international wars during the 58-year reign of Pedro II. These were the Platin War, the Uruguayan War and the devastating Paraguayan War, the largest war effort in Brazilian history. Although there was no desire among the majority of Brazilians to change the country's form of government, on November 15, 1889, in attrition with the majority of army officers, as well as with rural and financial elites, for different reasons, the monarchy was overthrown by a military coup. 15th of November is now Republic Day, a national holiday. Early Republic. The early Republican government was nothing more than a military dictatorship, with army dominating affairs both in Rio de Janeiro and in the States. Freedom of the press disappeared and elections were controlled by those in power. Not until 1894, following an economic crisis and a military one, did civilians take power, remaining there until October 1930. If in relation to its foreign policy, the country in this first Republican period maintained a relative balance characterized by a success in resolving border disputes with neighboring countries, only broken by the Acre War, 1899–1902, and its involvement in World War I, 1914–1918, followed by a failed attempt to exert a prominent role in the League of Nations. Internally, from the crisis of Isolamento and the Armada revolts, a prolonged cycle of financial, political and social instability began until the 1920s, keeping the country besieged by various rebellions, both civilian and military. Little by little, a cycle of general instability sparked by these crises undermined the regime to such an extent that in the wake of the murder of his running mate, the defeated opposition presidential candidate Getulio Vargas, supported by most of the military, successfully led the October 1930 coup. Vargas and the military were supposed to assume power temporarily, but instead closed the Congress, extinguished the Constitution, ruled with emergency powers and replaced the state's governors with their own supporters. In the 1930s, 3 failed attempts to remove Vargas and his supporters from power occurred. The first was the Constitutionalist Revolution in 1932, led by the Paulista oligarchy. The second was a communist uprising in November 1935, and the last one a putsch attempt by local fascists in May 1938. The 1935 uprising created a security crisis in which the Congress transferred more power to the executive. The 1937 coup d'état resulted in the cancellation of the 1938 election, formalized Vargas as dictator, beginning the Estado Novo era, which was noted for government brutality and censorship of the press. Foreign policy during Vargas' years was marked by the antecedents and World War II. Brazil remained neutral until August 1942, when the country entered on the Allied side, after suffering retaliation by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, in a strategic dispute over the South Atlantic. In addition to its participation in the Battle of the Atlantic, Brazil also sent an expeditionary force to fight in the Italian campaign. With the Allied victory in 1945 and the end of the Nazi-fascist regimes in Europe, Vargas's position became unsustainable and he was swiftly overthrown in another military coup, with democracy reinstated by the same army that had ended it 15 years earlier. Vargas committed suicide in August 1954 amid a political crisis, after having returned to power by election in 1950. Contemporary era. Several brief interim governments followed Vargas's suicide. Juscelino Kubitschek became president in 1956 and assumed a conciliatory posture towards the political opposition that allowed him to govern without major crises. The economy and industrial sector grew remarkably, but his greatest achievement was the construction of the new capital city of Brasilia, inaugurated in 1960. Kubitschek's successor, Jânio Quadros, resigned in 1961, less than a year after taking office. His vice president, João Goulart, assumed the presidency, but aroused strong political opposition and was deposed in April 1964 by a coup that resulted in a military regime. The new regime was intended to be transitory but gradually closed in on itself and became a full dictatorship with the promulgation of the Fifth Institutional Act in 1968. Oppression was not limited to those who resorted to guerrilla tactics to fight the regime, but also reached institutional opponents, artists, journalists and other members of civil society, inside and outside the country through the infamous Operation Condor. Despite its brutality, like other authoritarian regimes, due to an economic boom, known as an economic miracle, the regime reached a peak in popularity in the early 1970s. Slowly, however, the wear and tear of years of dictatorial power that had not slowed the repression, even after the defeat of the leftist guerrillas, plus the inability to deal with the economic crises of the period and popular pressure, made an opening policy inevitable, which from the regime side was led by Generals Ernesto Geisel and Galibari Couto e Silva. With the enactment of the amnesty law in 1979, Brazil began a slow return to democracy, which was completed during the 1980s. Civilians returned to power in 1985 when José Sarney assumed the presidency. He became unpopular during his tenure through failure to control the economic crisis and hyperinflation he inherited from the military regime. Sarney's unsuccessful government led to the election in 1989 of the almost unknown Fernando Collor, subsequently impeached by the National Congress in 1992. Collor was succeeded by his vice president, Itamar Franco, who appointed Fernando Henrique Cardoso Minister of Finance. In 1994, Cardoso produced a highly successful plan reel that, after decades of failed economic plans made by previous governments attempting to curb hyperinflation, finally stabilized the Brazilian economy. Cardoso won the 1994 election, and again in 1998. The peaceful transition of power from Cardoso to his main opposition leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, elected in 2002 and re-elected in 2006, was seen as proof that Brazil had achieved a long-sought political stability. However, sparked by indignation and frustrations accumulated over decades from corruption, police brutality, inefficiencies of the political establishment and public service, numerous peaceful protests erupted in Brazil from the middle of first term of Dilma Rousseff, who had succeeded Lula after winning election in 2010. Enhanced by political and economic crises with evidence of involvement by politicians from all the primary political parties in several bribery and tax evasion schemes, with large street protests for and against her, Rousseff was impeached by the Brazilian Congress in 2016. In 2017, the Supreme Court asked for the investigation of 71 Brazilian lawmakers and 9 ministers in President Michel Temer's cabinet allegedly linked to the Petrobras corruption scandal. President Temer is himself accused of corruption. In 2018, 62% of the population on a poll claimed that corruption was Brazil's biggest problem. Geography. Brazil occupies a large area along the eastern coast of South America and includes much of the continent's interior, sharing land borders with Uruguay to the south, Argentina and Paraguay to the southwest, Bolivia and Peru to the west, Colombia to the northwest, and Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname and France, French overseas region of French Guiana, to the north. It shares a border with every South American country except Ecuador and Chile. It also encompasses a number of oceanic archipelagos, such as Fernando de Noronha, Rocas Atoll, St. Peter, and Paul Rocks, and Trindade and Martin Vaz. Its size, relief, climate, and natural resources make Brazil geographically diverse. Including its Atlantic islands, Brazil lies between latitudes 6 degrees N and 34 degrees S, and longitudes 28 degrees and 74 degrees W. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world, and 3rd largest in the Americas, with a total area of 8,515, 767.049 square kilometers, 3,287,956 square miles, including 55,455 square kilometers, 21,411 square miles, of water. It spans 4 time zones: From Ike-5 comprising the state of Acre and the westernmost portion of Amazonas, to Ike-4 in the western states, to Ike-3 in the eastern states, the national time, and Ike-2 in the Atlantic Highlands. Brazil is the only country in the world that has the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn running through it. Brazilian topography is also diverse and includes hills, mountains, plains, highlands, and scrublands. Much of the terrain lies between 200 meters, 660 feet, and 800 meters, 2,600 feet, in elevation. The main upland area occupies most of the southern half of the country. The northwestern parts of the plateau consist of broad, rolling terrain broken by low, rounded hills. The southeastern section is more rugged, with a complex mass of ridges and mountain ranges reaching elevations of up to 1,200 meters, 3,900 feet. These ranges include the Mantiqueira and Espinhuço Mountains and the Serra do Marche. In the north, the Guiana Highlands form a major drainage divide, separating rivers that flow south into the Amazon basin from rivers that empty into the Orinoco River system, in Venezuela, to the north. The highest point in Brazil is the Pico de Neblina at 2,994 meters, 9,823 feet, and the lowest is the Atlantic Ocean. Brazil has a dense and complex system of rivers, one of the world's most extensive, with 8 major drainage basins, all of which drain into the Atlantic. Major rivers include the Amazon, the world's second longest river and the largest in terms of volume of water, the Parana and its major tributary the Iguaçu, which includes the Iguaçu Falls, the Negro, São Francisco, Xingu, Madeira and Tapajós rivers. Climate. The climate of Brazil comprises a wide range of weather conditions across a large area and varied topography, but most of the country is tropical. According to the Köppen system, Brazil hosts 6 major climatic subtypes: desert, equatorial, tropical, semi-arid, oceanic and subtropical. The different climatic conditions produce environments ranging from equatorial rainforests in the north and semi-arid deserts in the northeast, to temperate coniferous forests in the south and tropical savannas in central Brazil. Many regions have starkly different microclimates. An equatorial climate characterizes much of northern Brazil. There is no real dry season, but there are some variations in the period of the year when most rain falls. Temperatures average 25 degrees Celsius, 77 degrees Fahrenheit, with more significant temperature variation between night and day than between seasons. Over central Brazil, rainfall is more seasonal, characteristic of a savanna climate. This region is as extensive as the Amazon basin but has a very different climate as it lies farther south at a higher altitude. In the interior northeast, seasonal rainfall is even more extreme. The semi-arid climatic region generally receives less than 800 millimeters, 31.5 in, of rain, most of which generally falls in a period of 3 to 5 months of the year and occasionally less than this, creating long periods of drought. Brazil's 1877-78 Grand Seca, Great Drought, the worst in Brazil's history, caused approximately 500,000 deaths. A similarly devastating drought occurred in 1915. South of Bahia, near the coasts, and more southerly most of the state of São Paulo, the distribution of rainfall changes, with rain falling throughout the year. The south enjoys subtropical conditions, with cool winters and average annual temperatures not exceeding 18 degrees Celsius, 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter frosts and snowfall are not rare in the highest areas. Biodiversity and environment. Brazil's large territory comprises different ecosystems, such as the Amazon rainforest, recognized as having the greatest biological diversity in the world, with the Atlantic forest and the Cerrado, sustaining the greatest biodiversity. In the south, the Araucaria pine forest grows under temperate conditions. The rich wildlife of Brazil reflects the variety of national habitats. Scientists estimate that the total number of plant and animal species in Brazil could approach 4 million, mostly invertebrates. Larger mammals include carnivores pumas, jaguars, ocelots, rare bush dogs, and foxes, and herbivores peccaries, tapirs, anteaters, sloths, opossums, and armadillos. Deer are plentiful in the south, and many species of New World monkeys are found in the northern rainforests. Concern for the environment has grown in response to global interest in environmental issues. Brazil's Amazon basin is home to an extremely diverse array of fish species, including the red-bellied piranha. By 2013, Brazil's dramatic policy-driven reduction in Amazon basin deforestation was a global exception in terms of forest change, according to scientific journal Science. From 2003 to 2011, compared to all other countries in the world, Brazil had the largest decline in annual forest loss, as indicated in the study using high-resolution satellite maps showing global forest cover changes. The annual loss of forest cover decreased from a 2003-2004 record high of more than 40,000 square kilometers, 4,000 times 103 hectares, 9.9 times 106 acres, 15,000 square miles, to a 2010-2011 low of under 20,000 square kilometers, 2,000 times 103 hectares, 4.9 times 106 acres, 7,700 square miles, reversing widespread deforestation from the 1970s to 2003s. However, in 2019, when the Bolsonaro government came to power, the rate of deforestation of the Amazon rainforest increased sharply, threatening to reach a tipping point. After it, the forest will collapse, which will have severe consequences for the world. See tipping points in the climate system. This can also complicate the trade agreement with the European Union. Speaking at the UN General Assembly, Bolsonaro criticized what he described as sensational reporting in the international media. It is a fallacy to say that the Amazon is the heritage of humankind, and a misconception, as confirmed by scientists, to say that our Amazonian forests are the lungs of the world. Using these fallacies, certain countries, instead of helping, embarked on the media lies and behaved in a disrespectful manner and with a colonialist spirit. He said. President Jair Bolsonaro asserted Brazil's sovereignty over the Amazon. According to a 2008 Greenpeace article, the national heritage of Brazil is severely threatened by cattle ranching and agriculture, logging, mining, resettlement, oil and gas extraction, overfishing, wildlife trade, dams and infrastructure, water pollution, climate change, fire, and invasive species. In many areas of the country, the natural environment is threatened by development. The construction of highways has opened up previously remote areas for agriculture and settlement, dams have flooded valleys and inundated wildlife habitats, and mines have scarred and polluted the landscape. At least 70 dams are said to be planned for the Amazon region, including the controversial Belo Monte hydroelectric dam. In summer 2019, 2 states in Brazil, Paraná and Santa Catarina, banned fracking, what will have positive effects on the climate and water quality, because the shale gas and shale oil reserves in the state of Paraná are the larger in the southern hemisphere. Government and politics. The form of government is a democratic federative republic, with a presidential system. The president is both head of state and head of government of the union and is elected for a 4-year term, with the possibility of re-election for a second successive term. The current president is Jair Bolsonaro. The previous president, Michel Temer, replaced Dilma Rousseff after her impeachment. The president appoints the ministers of state, who assist in government. Legislative houses in each political entity are the main source of law in Brazil. The National Congress is the federation's bicameral legislature, consisting of the Chamber of Deputies and the Federal Senate. Judiciary authorities exercise jurisdictional duties almost exclusively. Brazil is a democracy, according to the Democracy Index 2010. The political administrative organization of the Federative Republic of Brazil comprises the Union, the states, the federal district, and the municipalities. The Union, the states, the federal district, and the municipalities, are the spheres of government. The federation is set on 5 fundamental principles: sovereignty, citizenship, dignity of human beings, the social values of labor and freedom of enterprise, and political pluralism. The classic tripartite branches of government, executive, legislative and judicial under a checks and balances system, are formally established by the Constitution. The executive and legislative are organized independently in all three spheres of government, while the judiciary is organized only at the federal and state and federal district spheres. All members of the executive and legislative branches are directly elected. Judges and other judicial officials are appointed after passing entry exams. For most of its democratic history, Brazil has had a multi-party system, proportional representation. Voting is compulsory for the literate between 18 and 70 years old and optional for illiterates and those between 16 and 18 or beyond 70. Together with several smaller parties, 4 political parties stand out: Workers' Party, PT, Brazilian Social Democracy Party, PSDB, Brazilian Democratic Movement, MDB, and Democrats, DEM. 15 political parties are represented in Congress. It is common for politicians to switch parties, and thus the proportion of congressional seats held by particular parties changes regularly. Almost all governmental and administrative functions are exercised by authorities and agencies affiliated to the executive. Law. Brazilian law is based on the civil law legal system, and civil law concepts prevail over common law practice. Most of Brazilian law is codified, although non-codified statutes also represent a substantial part, playing a complementary role. Court decisions set out interpretive guidelines, however, they are seldom binding on other specific cases. Doctrinal works and the works of academic jurists have strong influence in law creation and in law cases. The legal system is based on the federal constitution, promulgated on October 5, 1988, and the fundamental law of Brazil. All other legislation and court decisions must conform to its rules. As of April 2007, there have been 53 amendments. States have their own constitutions, which must not contradict the federal constitution. Municipalities and the federal district have organic laws, leis orgânicas, which act in a similar way to constitutions. Legislative entities are the main source of statutes, although in certain matters judiciary and executive bodies may enact legal norms. Jurisdiction is administered by the judiciary entities, although in rare situations the federal constitution allows the federal Senate to pass on legal judgments. There are also specialized military, labor, and electoral courts. The highest court is the Supreme Federal Court. This system has been criticized over the last few decades for the slow pace of decision-making. Lawsuits on appeal may take several years to resolve, and in some cases more than a decade elapses before definitive rulings. Nevertheless, the Supreme Federal Tribunal was the first court in the world to transmit its sessions on television, and also via YouTube. More recently, in December 2009, the Supreme Court adopted Twitter to display items on the day planner of the ministers, to inform the daily actions of the court and the most important decisions made by them. Military. The armed forces of Brazil are the largest in Latin America by active personnel and the largest in terms of military equipment. It consists of the Brazilian Army, including the Army Aviation Command, the Brazilian Navy, including the Marine Corps and Naval Aviation, and the Brazilian Air Force. Brazil's conscription policy gives it one of the world's largest military forces, estimated at more than 1.6 million reservists annually. Numbering close to 236,000 active personnel, the Brazilian Army has the largest number of armored vehicles in South America, including armored transports and tanks. It is also unique in Latin America for its large, elite forces specializing in unconventional missions, the Brazilian Special Operations Command, and the versatile Strategic Rapid Action Force, made up of highly mobilized and prepared Special Operations Brigade, Infantry Brigade Parachutist, 1st Jungle Infantry Battalion, Airmobile, and 12th Brigade Light Infantry, Airmobile, able to act anywhere in the country, on short notice, to counter external aggression. The state's military police and the military firefighters corps are described as an ancillary forces of the Army by the Constitution, but are under the control of each state's governor. Brazil's Navy, the second largest in the Americas, once operated some of the most powerful warships in the world with the 2 Minas Gerais-class dreadnoughts, which sparked a South American dreadnought race between Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Today, It is a green water force and has a group of specialized elite and retaking ships and naval facilities, GRUMEC, units specially trained to protect Brazilian oil platforms along its coast. It is the only navy in Latin America that operates an aircraft carrier, NA São Paulo, and one of the 10 navies of the world to operate one. The Air Force is the largest in Latin America and has about 700 manned aircraft in service and effective about 67,000 personnel. Brazil has not been invaded since 1865 during the Paraguayan War. Additionally, Brazil has no contested territorial disputes with any of its neighbors and neither does it have rivalries, like Chile and Bolivia have with each other. The Brazilian military has also 3 times intervened militarily to overthrow the Brazilian government. It has built a tradition of participating in UN peacekeeping missions such as in Haiti, East Timor, and Central African Republic. Brazil signed the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Foreign policy. Brazil's international relations are based on Article 4 of the Federal Constitution, which establishes non-intervention, self-determination, international cooperation and the peaceful settlement of conflicts as the guiding principles of Brazil's relationship with other countries and multilateral organizations. According to the Constitution, the President has ultimate authority over foreign policy, while the Congress is tasked with reviewing and considering all diplomatic nominations and international treaties, as well as legislation relating to Brazilian foreign policy. Brazil's foreign policy is a byproduct of the country's unique position as a regional power in Latin America, a leader among developing countries, and an emerging world power. Brazilian foreign policy has generally been based on the principles of multilateralism, peaceful dispute settlement, and non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. Brazil is a founding member state of the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, also known as the Lusophone Commonwealth, and International Organization and Political Association of Lusophone Nations across 4 continents, where Portuguese is an official language. An increasingly well-developed tool of Brazil's foreign policy is providing aid as a donor to other developing countries. Brazil does not just use its growing economic strength to provide financial aid, but it also provides high levels of expertise and most importantly of all, a quiet non-confrontational diplomacy to improve governance levels. Total aid is estimated to be around $1 billion per year, which includes technical cooperation of around $480 million, $30 million in 2010 provided directly by the Brazilian Cooperation Agency, ABC. Estimated $450 million for in-kind expertise provided by Brazilian institutions specializing in technical cooperation. In addition, Brazil manages a peacekeeping mission in Haiti, $350 million, and makes in-kind contributions to the World Food Program, $300 million. This is in addition to humanitarian assistance and contributions to multilateral development agencies. The scale of this aid places it on par with China and India. The Brazilian South-South aid has been described as a global model in waiting. Law enforcement and crime. In Brazil, the Constitution establishes 5 different police agencies for law enforcement: Federal Police Department, Federal Highway Police, Federal Railroad Police, Military Police, and Civil Police. Of these, the first 3 are affiliated with federal authorities and the last 2 are subordinate to state governments. All police forces are the responsibility of the executive branch of any of the federal or state powers. The National Public Security Force also can act in public disorder situations arising anywhere in the country. The country still has above average levels of violent crime and particularly high levels of gun violence and homicide. In 2012, the World Health Organization, WHO, estimated the number of 32 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, one of the highest rates of homicide of the world. The number considered tolerable by the WHO is about 10 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. In 2018, Brazil had a record 63,880 murders. However, there are differences between the crime rates in the Brazilian states. While in São Paulo the homicide rate registered in 2013 was 10.8 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants, In Alagoas it was 64.7 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Brazil also has high levels of incarceration and the third largest prison population in the world, behind only China and the United States, with an estimated total of approximately 700,000 prisoners around the country. June 2014, an increase of about 300% compared to the index registered in 1992. The high number of prisoners eventually overloaded the Brazilian prison system, leading to a shortfall of about 200,000 accommodations. Administrative divisions. Brazil is a federation composed of 26 states, 1 federal district, and the 5,570 municipalities. States have autonomous administrations, collect their own taxes and receive a share of taxes collected by the federal government. They have a governor and a unicameral legislative body elected directly by their voters. They also have independent courts of law for common justice. Despite this, states have much less autonomy to create their own laws than in the United States. For example, criminal and civil laws can be voted by only the federal bicameral Congress and are uniform throughout the country. The states and the federal district may be grouped into regions: northern, northeast, central west, southeast, and southern. The Brazilian regions are merely geographical, not political or administrative divisions, and they do not have any specific form of government. Although defined by law, Brazilian regions are useful mainly for statistical purposes, and also to define the distribution of federal funds in development projects. Municipalities, as the states, have autonomous administrations, collect their own taxes and receive a share of taxes collected by the union and state government. Each has a mayor and an elected legislative body, but no separate court of law. Indeed, a court of law organized by the state can encompass many municipalities in a single justice administrative division called comarca, county. Economy. Brazil is the largest national economy in Latin America, the world's 9th largest economy and the 8th largest in purchasing power parity, PPP, according to 2018 estimates. Brazil has a mixed economy with abundant natural resources. After rapid growth in preceding decades, the country entered an ongoing recession in 2014 amid a political corruption scandal and nationwide protests. Its gross domestic product, PPP, per capita was $15,919 in 2017, putting Brazil in the 77th position according to IMF data. Active in agricultural, mining, manufacturing and service sectors, Brazil has a labor force of over 107 million, ranking 6th worldwide, and unemployment of 6.2%, ranking 64th worldwide. The country has been expanding its presence in international financial and commodities markets, and is one of a group of 4 emerging economies called the BRIC countries. Brazil has been the world's largest producer of coffee for the last 150 years. Brazil's diversified economy includes agriculture, industry, and a wide range of services. Agriculture and allied sectors like forestry, logging and fishing accounted for 5.1% of the GDP in 2007. Brazil is one of the largest producer of oranges, coffee, sugarcane, cassava and sisal, soybeans and papayas. Industry in Brazil, from automobiles, steel and petrochemicals to computers, aircraft and consumer durables, accounted for 30.8% of the gross domestic product. Industry is highly concentrated in metropolitan São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Campinas, Porto Alegre, and Belo Horizonte. Brazil has become the 4th largest car market in the world. Major export products include aircraft, electrical equipment, automobiles, ethanol, textiles, footwear, iron ore, steel, coffee, orange juice, soybeans and corned beef. In total, Brazil ranks 23rd worldwide in value of exports. Brazil pegged its currency, the real, to the US dollar in 1994. However, after the East Asian financial crisis, the Russian default in 1998 and the series of adverse financial events that followed it, the Central Bank of Brazil temporarily changed its monetary policy to a managed float regime scheme while undergoing a currency crisis, until definitively changing the exchange regime to free float in January 1999. Brazil received an International Monetary Fund, IMF, rescue package in mid-2002 of $30.4 billion, a record sum at the time. Brazil's central bank repaid the IMF loan in 2005, although it was not due to be repaid until 2006. One of the issues the Central Bank of Brazil recently dealt with was an excess of speculative short-term capital inflows to the country, which may have contributed to a fall in the value of the US dollar against the real during that period. Nonetheless, foreign direct investment, FDI, related to long-term, less speculative investment and production, is estimated to be $193.8 billion for 2007. Inflation monitoring and control currently plays a major part in the central bank's role in setting short-term interest rates as a monetary policy measure. Between 1993 and 2010, 7,012 mergers and acquisitions with a total known value of $707 billion with the involvement of Brazilian firms were announced. The year 2010 was a new record in terms of value with $115 billion in transactions. The largest transaction with involvement of Brazilian companies was the CIA. Vale do Rio Doce acquisition of Inco in a tender offer valued at $18.9 billion. Corruption costs Brazil almost $41 billion a year alone in 2010, with 69.9% of the country's firms identifying the issue as a major constraint in successfully penetrating the global market. Local government corruption is so prevalent that voters perceive it as a problem only if it surpasses certain levels, and only if a local media, for example a radio station, is present to divulge the findings of corruption charges. Initiatives, like this exposure, strengthen awareness, which is indicated by the Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, ranking Brazil 69th out of 178 countries in 2012. The purchasing power in Brazil is eroded by the so-called Brazil cost. Brazil also has a large cooperative sector that provides 50% of the food in the country. The world's largest healthcare cooperative, Anand, is also located in Brazil, and accounts for 32% of the healthcare insurance market in the country. Energy. Brazil is the world's 10th largest energy consumer, with much of its energy coming from renewable sources, particularly hydroelectricity and ethanol. The Itaipu Dam is the world's largest hydroelectric plant by energy generation. The first car with an ethanol engine was produced in 1978 and the first airplane engine running on ethanol in 2005. Recent oil discoveries in the pre-salt layer have opened the door for a large increase in oil production. The governmental agencies responsible for the energy policy are the Ministry of Mines and Energy, the National Council for Energy Policy, the National Agency of Petroleum, Natural Gas, and Biofuels, and the National Agency of Electricity. Tourism. Tourism in Brazil is a growing sector and key to the economy of several regions of the country. The country had 6.36 million visitors in 2015, ranking in terms of the international tourist arrivals as the main destination in South America and second in Latin America after Mexico. Revenues from international tourists reached $6 billion in 2010, showing a recovery from the 2008 to 2009 economic crisis. Historical records of 5.4 million visitors and $6.8 billion in receipts were reached in 2011. Natural areas are its most popular tourism product, a combination of ecotourism with leisure and recreation, mainly sun and beach, and adventure travel, as well as cultural tourism. Among the most popular destinations are the Amazon rainforest, beaches and dunes in the Northeast region, the Pantanal in the Center-West region, beaches at Rio de Janeiro and Santa Catarina, cultural tourism in Minas Gerais, and business trips to Sao Paulo. In terms of the 2015 Travel and Tourism Competitiveness Index, TTCI, which is a measurement of the factors that make it attractive to develop business in the travel and tourism industry of individual countries, Brazil ranked in the 28th place at the world's level, third in the Americas, after Canada and the United States. Brazil's main competitive advantages are its national resources, which ranked first on this criteria out of all countries considered, and ranked 23rd for its cultural resources, due to its many World Heritage Sites. The TTCI report notes Brazil's main weaknesses: its ground transport infrastructure remains underdeveloped, ranked 116th, with the quality of roads ranking in 105th place, and the country continues to suffer from a lack of price competitiveness, ranked 114th, due in part to high ticket taxes and airport charges, as well as high prices and high taxation. Safety and security have improved significantly, 75th in 2011, up from 128th in 2008. According to the World Tourism Organization, WTO, international travel to Brazil accelerated in 2000, particularly during 2004 and 2005. However, in 2006 a slowdown took place, and international arrivals had almost no growth in 2007-08. In spite of this trend, revenues from international tourism continued to rise, from $4 billion in 2005 to $5 billion in 2007, despite 330,000 fewer arrivals. This favorable trend is the result of the strong devaluation of the US dollar against the Brazilian real, which began in 2004, but which makes Brazil a more expensive international destination. This trend changed in 2009, when both visitors and revenues fell as a result of the Great Recession of 2008-09. By 2010, the industry had recovered, and arrivals grew above 2006 levels to 5.2 million international visitors, and receipts from these visitors reached $6 billion. In 2011 the historical record was reached with 5.4 million visitors and $6.8 billion in receipts. Despite continuing record-breaking international tourism revenues, the number of Brazilian tourists traveling overseas has been growing steadily since 2003, resulting in a net negative foreign exchange balance, as more money is spent abroad by Brazilians than comes in as receipts from international tourists visiting Brazil. Tourism expenditures abroad grew from $5.8 billion in 2006, to $8.2 billion in 2007, a 42% increase, representing a net deficit of $3.3 billion in 2007, as compared to $1.5 billion in